do we have a full enough handle on how this virus is affecting not only demand in China, but psychology outside of it?
No, I think that's a very good question, and I think the absolute accurate answer would be no one knows, right? But the reality is that if you look at some of the momentum on the virus and the rate of infection is slowing down. So I think Wall Street typically looks at the second derivative impact, which seems to be moderating a bit. There are still a lot of unknowns, but at this point, I think what gives us some silver lining is that the facilities in China are beginning to open and people are slowly coming back to work compared to like a week or 2 weeks ago. But to your point, if you're in the same situation a month from now, maybe numbers have to be readjusted. And I think that's one of the challenges that Apple has in giving out a quantifiable guidance is the fact that the supply chain is not still up to 100% utilization rate, and it might probably take through end of the quarter before it gets there.
Krish, this is the second time in 13 months that Apple has slashed its guidance due to weakness in China. Now, I realize the circumstances in 2019 very different than what we're talking about here with coronavirus in 2020, but I think it raises the question for a market that has long been seen as a growth point for Apple. Is it now the biggest challenge, especially when you see how much exposure it does have, both in terms of iPhone demand and in terms of that supply chain?
It's a very valid point, and you're beginning to see the impact today, both in terms of demand and supply, like you highlighted, Morgan. And the thing I would argue is that, what they've done over the last 8 or 9 months is slowly move the supply chain out of China. Like they have a Foxconn facility in India, which is beginning to manufacture iPhones. These things don't happen overnight, given the complexity of the supply chain. But at the same time, I would also argue that the bear argument is you're over-indexed to China. You need to slow that down, which kind of makes sense, especially in today's environment. But at the same time, there is a big opportunity for Apple in China on the services side. On the iPhone side, they've been losing some share, but on the services side, there's probably still some growth left.
So would you expect to see more production move out of China then for Apple?
It's tough to say, but I would say that over time that could happen. Do I see that happening in the next couple of years? It's probably tough at this point. But, the Foxconn in India is ramping up output already. So I think you have like certain piece in place, but I don't have a exact figure on like when that's going to happen, though.
Krish, more broadly, what do you think the impact is going to be on supply chains that run through China? Because we just had, throughout the past year, big questions, pressure trade-wise being placed on companies to diversify out of China. Some did that. Some did it perhaps less than they might have otherwise. And then we have this very different coronavirus impact, which I imagine might be pressing some companies to think about, well, regardless of trade issues, maybe we need to think about having some other options. When will we know whether companies are thinking in that way, even beyond the trade issues because of coronavirus, or if, in fact, China has shown to be so essential that despite trade shocks and virus shocks, companies are just putting all their eggs in that basket?
I would say, John, companies have been beginning to move their supply chain out of China at a very slower pace, though. There are some companies in my semiconductor coverage that have facilities in China. Some of them are moving it to places like Malaysia, etc. So I would say that the movement is happening. It's probably not happening at the fast pace that you and I would expect. But the reality is that it's very easy to put numbers on an Excel sheet and make it work. But in the real world, moving some of the supply chain, the logistics, trying to have a copy exact philosophy in a third-party facility from China, it takes a long time.
Krish, I'm glad you brought up the semi-stocks that you cover, given the fact that you are tuned into that space. I mean, we've seen the pressure, the tensions on Huawei from the U.S. ratchet up pretty markedly in the last couple of days, whether it's what I would stress is bipartisan senior U.S. official commentary out of the Munich Security Conference over the weekend. You got the Justice Department charging Huawei and 2 subsidiaries with racketeering and theft of trade secrets. And then now headlines that the U.S. is considering regulatory changes to essentially cut off Huawei from global chip suppliers more broadly. How does this play out? What does it mean for those names you do cover in the space?
It's a very good question, and I think people are still trying to figure out what's going to happen, because the reality is that a lot of this we are hearing is bits and pieces from here and there. There's not been an exact mandate on what needs to be done. But the bottom line is it is a negative impact, because if you look at it, whether you look at Huawei as part of the semiconductor supply chain, or even if you look at some of the manufacturing facilities like TSMC that makes for Huawei, it's a very important part of the semiconductor ecosystem. So I do think that any of these rules or regulation that goes into effect will have an impact. It's very hard to quantify at this point. When I look at the semiconductor industry, semiconductor capex from China is about 10 to 15% of the global spending, and another 15-20% is TSMC. And both of them are either exposed to Huawei or to China. So you're probably looking at, that could be a contagion risk, I would say. But we still don't know how it's going to play out. But it is, you can see some of these stocks are down. I think investors are kind of having like a wait and see approach, because things could change on a dime with regards to what happens on the political spectrum.